Good afternoon. This is Jim Rathbun. I'm at the Wesleyan headquarters in Indianapolis. I want to welcome all of you here. Give you a little bit of what's happening today. There's about a 35 to 40-minute presentation, and that's a PowerPoint presentation, so you can have access to your screens, and there'll be different things coming up on your screen in the PowerPoint. Also questions. If you have any questions during the PowerPoint, off to the right-hand side of your screen is a place where you can ask questions, and we'll have question time for the last 20 minutes or so. Then if there's any problem with you can't hear what's going on or mics or anything like that, ask those same questions, and we have people here that can hopefully answer some of those questions for you. Let's open in a word of prayer. Father, I thank you for today, and I thank you for being a generous God. You sent your Son to this earth to die for us, and we're grateful for that, and it's your generosity that you poured on us. And as we talk about the topic of unleashing generosity in our churches, we ask that you would speak during this next hour, open our eyes and give us new ideas and creative ways to unleash generosity within our church. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. This afternoon, our purpose is what would happen if Christians would shift this culture of greed in which we live to become a culture of generosity, to the point where people would say those people are Christians because they're generous. That is what this whole time is about. We want to shift the culture of this greed in this world to a culture of generosity. On the phone today is myself, and then we basically have a very good partnership with a group called Generous Church. I consider them part of my staff. We probably talk on a weekly basis, but it's a separate organization, and they have partnered with us. Patrick Johnson and Sharon Epps will be our presenter today. So Patrick and Sharon, take it away.
Wonderful, Jim. This is Patrick Johnson. I'm the founder of Generous Church. I'm delighted to be with Sharon today. And just before we get started, I would say we're delighted to work with the General Superintendent's Office. And already we've reached hundreds of leaders of Wesleyan churches all across the country around this topic of biblical generosity. And it's been really energizing, I think, our work together. So Jim and everyone there, we greatly appreciate you. Let me tell you a little bit about Generous Church and our mission. We're a nonprofit organization. We're funded primarily by the McClellan Foundation out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we have a mission to equip leaders in churches to unleash generous disciples. A couple of key words there. Number one, leaders. We believe that generosity is led by leaders in churches, so we want to equip you to unleash generous disciples. And this concept of unleashing generous disciples is a really important concept because we believe biblical generosity is first and foremost a spiritual transformation model before a church business model. And Sharon and I have been doing this for over 10 years now. And what we see is that when people start to really understand biblical generosity and God's plan for them to be biblically generous, then really it catalyzes their spiritual growth. And it's always exciting to see people in churches to begin to wake up every day thinking about how can we be a blessing to the world around us today. So when their feet hit the floor in the morning, we want people to really understand that they are hardwired to be generous. That's the way God created us. And there is a church business model with giving, but we think if you put the spiritual transformation first, then the church business model will happen as well. As a matter of fact, we learned this from Andy Stanley. One of the first conferences that Sharon and I ever did together was about 11 years ago in North Point Church there in Atlanta. And Andy said to about 600 church leaders, he said, do the people you lead in your church know what you want for them when it comes to generosity, or do they just know what you want from them? So in other words, do they know what you want for them when it comes to biblical generosity? Do they know that you want this full life that God has for them? Do they want you to experience the joy of giving? Or when you talk about stewardship or generosity, is it always about what you want from them? And I think that's a really great question for us to ask each other as church leaders. Because when people know what you want for them, then they let down their guard, they push into this issue, which can be a trying issue for a lot of people. And then when you need to ask something from them, you've developed a strong trust level there. So this from versus for is a really key concept in our work with church leaders, and I think that's really important. So what we seek to do is unleash the generosity story of a church and its people. And this is a really key thing too, is people change when they see and experience a better story. So when people see a better story, when they experience something, they change. And so let me just sort of start this time by telling you a story real quick. Brookfield Christian Reformed Church. It's a church in sunny Brookfield, Wisconsin. And I was just up there a week ago with this church. And Brookfield's a church of about 450, longtime church in that community. A very conservative church. You know, up in that area, people hold things pretty close to the vest, and they joke about that. And so what happened was the treasurer of the church, a guy named Ryan, who you see in the top left-hand corner, came to a half-day generosity encounter that we did. That's one of the things that we've been doing with Wesleyan pastors as well. It's really a half-day deep dive on many of the concepts you're going to hear here. But Ryan came to this conference because he was the treasurer of the church. They had about a $100,000 gap between their income and their budget, and he was looking for ways to really press into that. And so Ryan came to it, and he came into this thinking church business model, but he heard a lot of the concepts we're going to cover today, and he heard about this spiritual transformation model, and it really changed the way he thought about this. And so he immediately says he got in his car after this half day, went to his pastor, Peter, and said, listen, I need to share some things with you. And he and Peter started talking about it. They pulled some other leaders into it, and eventually Paula, who was on staff at the church, really started executing the day-to-day operations of what does it mean to push into biblical generosity as a spiritual formation issue. So let me tell you how they did that. They started with an assessment, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So they found out where their people were when it comes to biblical generosity. But then they spent 6 weeks in the church really focused on the topic of generosity. And then they drove it down to their small groups. So their small groups spent about 4 weeks really studying together, and they were all aligned around this topic from a really fresh perspective. The small groups got engaged in some missional activities outside of their small groups. As a matter of fact, one of the small groups did about 100 mattresses for homeless ministries there in the Wisconsin area, in the Milwaukee area, and they distributed that. And then they actually brought it down to the youth. So if you look there, the elders actually did 4 weeks of teaching with the youth while the whole church was aligned around this topic of generosity. It was a really powerful time. And some of the words they used to describe this is it was energizing, it was unifying, it created a buzz. And how many times do you think about those types of words around the concept of generosity? So it was really powerful for them. But then they thought about, how do we extend this? So we started this, we spent months on it, but how do we extend it so that it's not one or done? It's not something we focused on. So they got a vision for what they could do as a church and as well as involve the community. And this is where Dig Deep came, Water for Africa. A couple of months ago, they launched this, or actually a month ago, and their goal is to buy some well drilling equipment to create clean water in a village in Africa that they have a partnership with that they're working in other areas. So they want to bring clean water to this as well. And so their vision is $75,000 over a 3-month period they want to raise involving the community to basically go out and buy this well drilling equipment for Africa. So they've gone door to door and put bottles, water bottles, and explained to their neighbors what this was about. They've really gotten out into the community. So what's cool about this is that generosity's gone from a spiritual formation to actually spilling out of the church into the community. I got a quote from yesterday from Paula, and she said, one of the teachers in the church says, I picked up some extra paid assignments at work, and I'm donating all the money I make to this project. The work is frankly pretty boring. And before this, I avoided it. However, when I know the work I'm doing will help others have clean water, I find the task much easier. That's what a teacher in the church said. And that's how we know that people are starting to change. Their values are starting to shift. And this is what can happen when we focus our efforts on biblical generosity as a spiritual transformation issue versus a church business model. So how do we do that? Where do we start? I'm going to let Sharon Epps turn it over and sort of walk you through the first phases of this process. So Sharon, take it away.
So just like the story at Brookfield, we found that in our journey towards generosity and around biblical generosity that there's really a discipleship paradigm, that it's a process and not a point in time. And just like every other element of our discipleship, it's an area where we grow. And sometimes we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But we've created this generosity ladder to be a framework for church leaders to discover how to lead people at different points on their spiritual journey to unleash greater generosity. It helps us engage both the hearts, the minds, and even the lives and the hands of the congregation in a fresh way. So what do we mean by generosity ladder? We thought we'd show you an example of one. This is actually a pastor in Kansas City this past weekend that as we taught the church about the different phases of the discipleship of generosity, he actually preached a sermon and, believe it or not, did it atop an 18-foot ladder as he talked about what it meant to unleash generosity. Now, let me put your fears to rest for a minute. Engaging in this journey doesn't mean that you have to preach from an 18-foot ladder, but we really did appreciate his creativity as he did that. So what is the components of the ladder and what does it really mean? If we consider that it's a framework, what we want to do is begin to think about the discipleship journey of our people, not in just a bifold way of are they givers or non-givers, or are they tithers or non-tithers, but we really want to look at where they are in their journey towards generosity. And so you'll see that there are 8 different points of this journey. All of us have experienced different places along the way as we've gone on our journey. Let me just in general point out a few things about the generosity journey and the ladder. The first one is down towards the left-hand side. You'll see that as someone begins their generosity journey, are those people that are in fact non-generous. In fact, in the assessment that Patrick mentioned, we have people that will state, I don't have the capacity to give money or time at this time. And so they're just literally in the beginnings of their journey. As people begin to step out into generosity, often this lower end of the ladder is more what we would call feel-good generosity. There is a relieving of guilt, or there's a self-motivation even in our giving. But as we experience breakthroughs and learn more, like the fact that God owns everything, then our generosity begins to grow and begins to be focused more on others. We progress to this mid-range of the ladder of the doing good and safe giving. What we like to say in this area is that our generosity is often after the fact generosity. So after we pay our bills, after we make sure that our goals are met, we are glad to give the remainder. But as you continue on the journey and look towards the right-hand side of the page, our progress moves to the point that we become percentage givers. We make decisions to give first. This is where traditional tithers would probably fall in the standpoint of we set aside our first fruits for God. There's additional steps in the journey as we become more sacrificial and we experience this breakthrough to understand that we're holding our hands loosely and we literally surrender what we have to God for His will and for His purposes. And so sacrificial and kingdom view givers are those ones that say, anytime, anywhere, God, I'm here for you. And so this framework becomes a launch point for our conversation, and we look at how to disciple people differently based on where they are on this ladder. You would speak differently to a non-generous person versus one who is at that level of safe giving. And those that are kingdom view and surrender givers can be great role models and mentors for others that are on their giving journey. But how do we lead people up this generosity ladder? How do we help them experience this life that's truly life that God truly wants for them? And the first step that we take is we really assess the current generosity health. We've had an opportunity now to assess over 15,000 givers that are in our database. And we start with 17 questions. There's questions that help them measure their values, their beliefs. We look at what their obstacles are related to giving, and as well as their practices of giving. And it begins to paint that story. Patrick mentioned the story of Brookfield. As we begin this journey with the church, we begin to paint a story of what are those generosity mindsets that are in the congregation. One of the critical questions that we ask is about their spiritual vitality. We ask, how would you describe your current relationship with Jesus right now? And you may just stop for a moment and say, well, wait a minute, I thought this discussion was about generosity. Why are you asking about the relationship with Jesus? Well, when generosity is truly seen as a discipleship issue, we realize that the relationship with the Lord is a key indicator of where they are on that journey. Here's some composite figures that we've seen across denominations and across churches that'll give you just a sneak peek into the vitality of these 15,000 givers that we have in our database. You'll be glad to see, and we celebrate the fact, that usually around half the people that take this assessment will say that they're active and growing deeper in their faith. And that's a key word. We want to target folks that are ready to grow, because this area of generosity will broaden their faith view. It will broaden their view of the Lord and allow them to experience kingdom life in fresh, new ways. There's another significant group, though, that we see, and you'll see it at the bottom of your screen, those that say, I'm secure in my faith, but I feel I'm spiritually dry and I need a jump start right now. And we have almost a quarter of the people in the congregations that report that they actually feel spiritually dry. And what a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to introduce the opportunity for them to give themselves away as a way that they are able to be refreshed. It reminds me of the Proverbs that he who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. You'll see the other categories here. 14% say that they're longtime Christians and they're comfortable where they are. And one of our concerns is that in that area is that perhaps they're blinded and not seeing opportunities for growth. But as you look at the spiritual vitality question, let's consider, what does it really tell us? First of all, we believe that generosity accelerates through the people that are growing spiritually. Because they want to grow deeper in their relationship with the Lord, they're open to these opportunities to grow in the discipleship of generosity. It's difficult for the people that are comfortable. We mentioned those that are saying, you know, I'm kind of comfortable where I am right now. They don't necessarily see growing generosity as a way that can actually accelerate and bring excitement to their life with the Lord. And so we have different communication mechanisms for them. But it's also important with those folks that are struggling with spiritual dryness, it's an opportunity actually for us as a body of believers to invest in them and to be generous with them, as well as to teach them this gospel of refreshment that generosity brings. Another area that we really look into in these assessments is financial stress and what keeps people from giving. Patrick, can you help us with that?
I'd be happy to, Sharon. So obviously, if we're going to call people to generosity, one area of generosity, even though it is a whole life experience, so we know that it's holistic, but one area is the financial stress. And so one of the things we want to look at is what best describes your financial state right now. So in the 15,000 givers that are in our database from about 60 churches from across the country, this is a sort of a composite of the financial stress that we see in churches. So you can see the first line, the green, I'm struggling right now, I wish I had some financial counseling. That's about 4 to 7% of people in a church. They're desperate enough and hurting enough where they need help. About 10 to 13%, the red line, are struggling to keep up with day-to-day expenses right now. Then we have about 30 to 35% that are fairly stable but just making ends meet. And then the last two categories are those who are secure, they're able to make ends meet and have some left over, that's 30%. And then the surplus, I have more than I need for myself and for my family. So you can see one of the ways that we look at it is about a third of the church is spending some type of financial stress at any one time. And about 2/3 have, they have some margin. They have some left over, or they have more than they need. But we know that as people begin to feel financially healthy, then they begin to be in a position where they can be more generous sometimes. So what does this mean? I want you to consider this. So, sometimes I know we work with churches and they offer traditional stewardship programs like Dave Ramsey or Crown or Good Sense, and those are all great programs. But the problem that we hear from most churches is it's hard to attract people to come to those programs. And one of the reasons we believe it may be difficult to attract people is because about a third of the people in our congregation have a felt need for these types of programs at one time. And I know these programs are more holistic than just the ones that are struggling, but a lot of times that's the people that get into these types of programs, and about a third of a congregation at any one time really has that felt need, so it's hard to get people to engage to become more financially healthy. But what we have seen in churches we've worked with is that when you lead with biblical generosity, it considers and attracts the whole church. And so the whole church gets involved in this better kingdom story. And then what we find is that people start to put into this deeper why. Then when you start to offer stewardship offerings, then people are more open and ready to do this. In other words, I want to be generous. I'm starting to experience the energy around this life of generosity. And so I want to be a faithful steward in order to be able to be generous. And so we think, and what we've seen is that when churches lead with generosity, then the stewardship becomes that much more powerful when you offer these kind of programs. Let me tell you a quick story. Old Cutler Presbyterian Church down in Miami, Florida. Old Cutler is a church of around 500, and we worked with them, and they had tried to get people to come to traditional stewardship offerings, but it's a very independent culture, very fast-paced culture. They were having a hard time doing it. So what they said is, let's lead with generosity. And so similar to what we saw at Brookfield, they spent 4 to 6 weeks on it. They did an assessment. They got their leaders engaged. And one of the things they started doing was they started partnering outside of the church with a battered women's shelter. It was Agape Ministry. And that was something new for them. That was something that they had not really done in the past. And so what they decided last weekend was not only were they going to partner to serve them, but they were going to do a one service and go and actually do a service at the women's shelter. And that was the first time they'd ever done a worship service outside the 4 walls of their church. And you can see a picture here of what that looked like. It was the battered women shelter and those that were in it and the church coming together to do a joint worship service. And what we saw was tremendous energy. I was looking at their Facebook page yesterday and some of the things that they were saying. So get this connection. So because people are pushing into a deeper story of biblical generosity and starting to get a bigger vision outside of themselves, then what happens is when we go back in to offer stewardship programs, we think and we've seen that people are more ready to push into those things because they have a deeper why behind it. And so Old Cutler's working towards that type of vision. So that's financial health. Let's look at another element out of our assessment. That's generosity motivations. So this is really a foundational question that we ask people. What motivates you the most to give? And we give them 4 choices, and we ask them to rank it by best, second best, third best, and least. And as you can see, about 46% of the people on the right-hand side, that green bar, said that their best motivation to give was out of grace. It's what God has given to me in Jesus Christ, and that motivates me to give. 46% of people, these 15,000 givers in these almost 60 churches, say that was the primary driver. And we love that motivation. We think that's a strong motivation that really catalyzes generosity. That's followed by obedience. 33% I give out of obedience. And then you can see love and to support the vision and mission of my church's program. So you can see this is a pretty wide range of motivations. And what we would say here is this, is to consider this. What mix of these do you think has the greatest opportunity for growth and generosity? So as we look back at this chart, what mix has it? Well, we can tell you that grace is always the leading driver. You need to connect generosity to the gospel, and that really opens up people. But then obedience will follow and love. But if you don't have that grace underlying it, then we don't think it's as powerful as it could be. The second thing I'd say is, what kind of church do you want to lead? Do you want to lead a church of people that are just obedient, or do you want to lead a church that really is pushing into this grace and generosity issue that we're talking about here? So those are 2 things that we look at when we consider motivations. And that's something you need to think about, your teaching and your language and how you speak to people and what you're teaching people. Are you teaching them out of obedience? Are you teaching them out of love? Are you teaching them out of support the work of the church? Are you teaching them out of the gospel? And we find to lead with that gospel orientation is a really powerful way. You can bring those other elements in, but build it on the gospel foundation. We have found that to be some of the most powerful way to approach this topic. So let's talk about barriers. Sharon?
So we've looked at the motivations, and we see grace being a very strong motivation, but we also ask people about their barriers. What's in your way? What's keeping you from this level of generosity that you would like? And I'm always amazed at the honesty of people in these assessments. There are literally over 60% of our respondents in our database who have said, you know, frankly, I just battle with selfishness. In fact, I was with a church leadership team just this past week. 7 of them have been journeying with us over the last 6 months in this whole area of growing generosity, and we particularly focused on the senior leadership of this church. And I just found it honest and endearing that these church leaders in my meetings with them said, you know what, we have been unleashed. We want to be sacrificial. We want to be surrendered, but quite frankly, we still battle with selfishness. And I think we have to be honest and bring that out of the darkness and into the light. And in community, we can help each other overcome that selfishness. You also see that a strong barrier there in the middle. Over 55% say that they just wish they had compassion for people in need. In another part of our assessment, we actually ask about the attitudes towards giving to the poor. And there are several areas where people respond, you know what, I would like to give, but I actually don't even know who to serve. And I think so often in today's society, we've been allowed to isolate ourselves from the people in need, and we don't see them on a daily basis. And that's an underlying factor that causes us not to have compassion. Most of us would be thrilled to help someone at our doorstep, and yet we don't see the needs and we're insulated from them. And then you feel like another strong barrier is just not being as intentional to live as selflessly as you would want to live. All of these things are things that can be overcome as we begin to preach this gospel of grace, begin to release people who 24/7 are thinking about how they can be the gospel of Christ. But let's consider this. How do we cultivate selflessness? We believe that generosity values, cultivating selfless generosity values, is the best way to encourage both a deeper spiritual vitality as well as greater generosity and giving in your church. And when we speak of generosity, it is a full life generosity, not just writing a check, but literally giving your time, of your skills, your expertise, your influence, and your financial resources. It is that surrendered life. And we believe that only occurs when you have deep generosity values. We want to differentiate quickly between generosity values and programs. I think this is what really causes a lot of confusion in our congregations, is that the whole topic of generosity has been approached really in three different ways. One has been funding, just basically what we call a wave of giving, that generosity represents a one-time event. So we've done a capital campaign, we've had an outreach campaign, but it's typically a big bump in giving money. Sometimes there's time associated with it, but then things settle back down to the prior giving levels. And so funding is one approach to the whole giving discussion. Another approach is programs, that what Patrick referred to earlier as one and done giving. We did a series on generosity, we offered a class, and now we're ready to move on to another topic. Both the funding and the programs approach may have its place at points in time, but our heart is that as we unleash generous disciples, that we are actually creating a new values culture, that we experience a rising tide of generosity, and that we are living and leading people up the generosity ladder so that they experience a full life. And if I had to summarize the differentiator that the Generous Living Department of the General Superintendent's Office as well as Generous Church longs, this what we want for you, not from you, is that in the Wesleyan churches we begin to see the value of generosity grow and multiply exponentially so that people are truly living full life generosity as really those that have been entrusted to be the hands and feet of Jesus every day. Now, one special group that we do want to highlight today and some key differences in these values of generosity is women. We've found through our assessment in our database that women have different approaches and different thoughts and mindsets relative to generosity. You'll see some of those on your screen. Women tend to respond in a greater percentage that they tend to be thankful, that they are also intentional about affirming others, that they also are showing compassion once they see needs. Women are more spontaneously generous. They report being more spontaneously generous than men. And perhaps a little bit more intentional about living a simple lifestyle. And we really point this out for you to consider just a few things. We've observed through our assessment and through what these women report that they tend to have that stronger values-based generosity than men. The men report action-based generosity, but the women seem to report more values-based generosity. We also see the women reporting that they are giving more outside the church than inside the church. And they tend to be the ones that have a stronger disconnect between the concept of the tithe and the church's vision. And just to add a couple of things here, women globally, women have been surveyed and asked the question, what is important to you in life? And no matter what culture, no matter what country, the uniform answer that women give, whether they're believers in Christ or not, is that we want to make the world a better place. And so I believe some of these stronger values that we're seeing underlying have to do with the fact that God's hardwired women for these generosity values. And we firmly believe that as the church, that when men and women give together, that they actually are more fully reflecting the image of Christ in the body of Christ. And so one of the things that we highly encourage is that men and women, husbands and wives, work together in this unleashing of generosity within their own lives and within their families. And we long to strengthen marriages by bringing women and men to the conversation so that we see these underlying values being able to work in the perfect dance that God intended for them to be.
Wonderful. So I'm going to take over and talk about the average church when it comes to the generosity ladder. So this is sort of a compilation of those 15,000 givers in our database. And if we look at the average church when it came to the ladder, then this is what we think we see. And I will say sort of a caveat to this. You know, if you give an assessment in a church, 17 questions, the people that are going to take the assessment are probably your key stakeholders in the church. They're the people that are most actively engaged, or the people that are drawn to this topic of stewardship and generosity. So when we look at these numbers, I want us to think about this probably represents about 15,000 of the best leaders in a typical church. And so if you look at your leadership, what I think is about 3% of them are non-generous. They're down on one end of the ladder. And then the vast majority of them, about 54%, the 20 and 34%, are somewhere in the middle of the ladder. They haven't really pressed into this topic and really connected it to their spiritual growth in Christ. And I think that represents around 54%. Then you have 33% that are somewhere in the percentage, maybe starting to go into sacrificial, and then 10% up at the top are the really kingdom view and sacrificial givers that we see. And that's pretty typical in a church. Is it about somewhere between 7 as high as around 14 to 15% are truly sacrificial givers. And so the question that I would have if you think about this ladder is, where's your church on this ladder? If you could put your leaders or your whole church on this ladder, do you think they look like this? Do you think about 54% are in the middle of the ladder, about 33% are probably somewhere with some discipline giving, and then 10% are in that sacrificial range, or are you different? And then the second thing I would ask is your church's generosity efforts focused on funding programs or values like Sharon talked about, and what have been the results? I think one of the reasons we see this ladder is because sometimes we haven't pushed hard enough into the values of generosity like we saw at Brookfield or we saw at Old Cutler. When you start to really press into the values of this together, then what we see is people start to grow up the ladder. And that's much different than a capital campaign or giving to a need. Those have their place. But I think if we want to sustainably grow people up this ladder, we really need to take a values approach to this. And I think that's what we're talking about here today. So I want to end with this verse before we open it up for questions and give you some next steps. You know, really, this is a key verse that I think you could really build your generosity language around. It's 1 Timothy 6:17 through 19. And it talks about when Paul commands Timothy to tell the rich in this present world to be generous and willing to share. It says that when they do this, when they're generous with everything, they will take hold of the life that is truly life. And that's really what we want for people. We want them to experience this full life. And that's such a different frame from a life of greed or consumption. When people start to really walk into this generous life, they really start to walk into the image of God, because God is a generous God, as Jim said. And when they start to walk into the image of what he created us to be, what they start to experience is life. And I see this over. We've been doing this long enough that, and you know, think about some of the most generous people in your life. If you think about these people, they are really walking into a different quality of life than most people in this consumer culture today. So that's really what we're calling people to, is this life that is truly life. It's what God wants for them, what we want for them as the shepherds of the people. So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you for some next steps before we take questions. So why don't you review this slide, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Patrick and Sharon. We're going to have questions here in a minute. And you can download an e-paper at Generous Church. You got the website there for that. And also, one of the things we're doing in districts this fall or summer, we're actually in Kansas. And then in the fall, we're in Ohio and East Michigan. We're doing Generous Church and conference or encounters. And those are about 5 to 6 hour an event where we walk more into detail on how to unleash generosity in your church. If you're not in one of those areas, talk to your DS about hosting one. We'd love to work with your district about doing that. Or you might just want to go right and engage with us and Generous Church in more detail. Couple questions, Patrick. How do you think stewardship and generosity differ from each other, and how do you feel they fit together?
Yeah, I'm going to let Sharon take that one, because she has an interesting perspective on that from some of the ministry that she's done. So Sharon, you want to take the first shot at that?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. One of the things we didn't mention early on is I had the privilege of leading a stewardship ministry at a church for about 7 years, and so that was a question we wrestled with a lot. And here's the simplest way I know to express it is I think generosity is actually our motivation for stewardship. If we have the belief that God owns everything and that we're his managers or faithful stewards, then that's the purest biblical definition of stewardship that I've been able to find. And so if we see our role as stewards and then ask where that fits in this whole realm of generosity, I really believe that because we have a generous God and because we're created in his image, our true motivation is generosity, to reflect his image. And good stewardship actually allows us to position ourselves in a place that we are able to be more generous.
Yeah, I would add to that too, that the reason we have things to be generous with, whether abilities, skills, time, talent, resources, is because of God's generosity. And one way I look at it is it really starts with God's generosity to us. And we have things to steward in our cultures because we have a generous God who entrusted us with things to steward. So I look at it as generosity sort of starts it, then we steward it for the result of greater generosity to reflect God's image. So I think that aligns with what you're saying, Sharon.
Yes.
Thank you. You talked about, I want to talk about tactical and transformational generosity. Go a little bit deeper in distinction between the two, tactical and transformational generosity.
So what we find is that, we've been talking about spiritual transformation over the last 40 minutes or so. And what we find is that a lot of people think of generosity and giving in tactical terms. And so it's just write a check. So Sharon referred to a question that we do in our How Generous Are We assessment regarding service to the poor. And we ask questions, how do you serve the poor? And one of the questions that answers that question is, I serve the poor by financially giving. And we find that about a third of people in most churches think of their financial giving as a way to serve the poor. And that we would describe that as tactical giving or tactical generosity. I write a check, and that's a good thing. We celebrate that. But what we find is about a third of people, another third, actually get involved in service to the poor. And what we find is that when you get your hands and feet involved and you actually come face to face, then your generosity moves from tactical to transformational. And think about it. If you've ever been on a short-term mission trip or been into maybe the inner city of your community, you know that when you get face to face with need, it does something to you as the giver. And that's what we start talking about transformational. So what we see is that people, if you want to lead someone from tactical generosity to transformational generosity, you have to call them to go beyond just financial giving to get involved in short-term missions, in inner city work. That's what we saw in the two churches, the examples. They're starting to see a transformational vision around generosity that's much deeper than just tactical. We celebrate both, but we call people up the ladder to a more transformational generosity life. Sharon, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the ladder. If you look back at the ladder, you'll notice that down in the left-hand side of the ladder, it tends to be more transactional. It tends to be, I see a place I can give money, and therefore I'll give money. It's more just I'll do this, and it'll be a specific act. And when we call people to full life generosity, it truly is that lifestyle. And the thing that I would say we see most in common with people that have experienced transformational generosity is what I would call availability. And that is they have a plan for their generosity, but they are also available to serve whenever God calls them. And so as you move up that ladder over to the right, those sacrificial and kingdom givers that have been transformed have an availability that it just basically is ready to say yes to God. And I think that's a key reason that we're able to celebrate transformational is because of the fact that they are available.
Yeah, let me just jump in with something else too that I think is key. As church leaders, so many times we hear, and I've been involved in leadership in a church, is that 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Or maybe sometimes it's even 10-90. And it's like you're going to the same people over and over again to really get involved in the work of the kingdom. And that gets tiring and it gets frustrating for those people and for you as their leaders. And I think that one of the reasons is because those people are really experiencing transformational generosity, and the other 80% are somewhere down the lower end of the ladder in a more tactical approach. So they might write a check to a project you're doing, but they're not going to get involved with their time. And so one of the benefits of really pressing into this in a different way, think differently, as Apple said, moving it from a church business model to a spiritual transformation model, is that you start to extend that 20% to a wider group. It starts to work inside out, and we start to see other people involved. So can you imagine if it moved to 50-50, or maybe 70% were involved and 30% were on the sidelines? That's what it means to go from tactical to transformational and to move people up the ladder. And that really is it's a huge win for churches when more people start to get involved. So when I saw Brookfield Christian, they sent us a video the other day, and they were doing a walk around their communities to put out these water bottles, and I was struck with just how many folks were engaged in that. And that's what we want. We want a wider group of people who are moving into this.
Great. Patrick, kind of a follow-up to that question is, what's a reasonable expectation of how fast a church or an individual could grow up the ladder of generosity?
Boy, that's a great question. Sharon, you want to take first shot, or you want me to?
Well, I think it's like any other spiritual discipleship, that we each have our own journey. I've literally seen people and churches transformed in 30 days when their whole heart is in, and I've seen others that have taken a lifetime. And I think part of it is how open are we to allow the Holy Spirit to truly transform our hearts and minds. We also know that it's a matter of practice, and so one of the things that I think is important is that as we lead people up the ladder, we give them opportunities to practice generosity, just like we help people grow in prayer by giving them opportunities to practice prayer. I think one of our roles as shepherds and as pastors is to give people opportunities to actually practice it.
I would say this too, Jim, to that question from a church perspective, is it really does move inside out. And so part of the half-day encounters that we do, we really talk about this inside-out model. What's the role of the pastor? What's the role of leaders and staff? And what I find is, whether you're a church of 200 or a church of 20,000, that if you start inside out, and to this degree that you can start to move the senior pastor and the core leaders around him or her and the staff, when they start really embracing it and digging down, that's when it starts to move quicker. In other words, you sort of reach a tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell says. Enough people start to get the vision, it starts to tip. And so really, if you focus inside and move out, you really need to think, okay, if I pastor a church of 400, do I need 40 leaders to really get this transformational generosity? Do I need 50? Or if you're a church of 10,000, do I need 1,000? Do I need 2,000? But you can really start inside out, and to the degree that it moves there is the degree that the quickness that will go from a church perspective.
Okay, a question. I'm surprised by the stats that I saw about the church members describe the current financial abilities. Is there a place where I can download these stats? And is there more information available about them?
Sure. So we'll be happy to share any of the stats that we have. Once again, our database is about 15,000. I will note one thing, and I don't know whether that was a good surprise or a bad surprise based upon the context that this person asked that question. But one of the trends we have seen is that as the economy gets better, the financial health tends to get better. And people start to, and remember this too, this is how they feel about their financial state. And so some of these stats that we're quoting is what people feel about their current financial state at a particular time. So there's a little bit of how we feel about this. There's economic sort of context to this as well, but we'd be happy to share this PowerPoint. If that person has any specific questions that they want to get with you, Jim, we'll be happy to go deeper on those stats because we do have a pretty good database of those kind of statistics.
Great. Just so everybody that's listening, the slides will be shared with you, and this is being recorded, and it will be posted probably in a week or so. Another question. Why doesn't a capital campaign create long-lasting generosity, and is there a way to change this?
I'll be glad to jump in on that one. I think if you think about the focus of a capital campaign, it tends to be more singular project oriented. And I know that many times during the season of a capital campaign, we may invest in the generosity discipleship of our folks, but as soon as the campaign goal is reached, the generosity investment also tends to fall off. So I think that the capital campaigns bring an emphasis, but the data that we see actually is that oftentimes you'll have a spike during the campaign, and in fact the giving levels will actually go down for a season afterwards. And the indication to us is that although people have become very excited about the project and they are wanting to participate and wanting to move forward, they haven't moved to that point that they've really had a renewed vision for what generosity is like, and they haven't moved to reorganizing their lives so that they can live more fully generous. And we found that it takes more than just a one-time emphasis, but it is a values arrangement that causes us to have a renewed and re-envisioned way of seeing generosity.
I will add too to that, Sharon, that the great thing about a capital campaign is it gives you a lot of energy around a specific vision, as Sharon said. But what I have found, I mean, we've worked with pastors that have been pastors for 25 and 30 years, and one common theme that I heard is when we really focus on generosity as a spiritual transformation and we get the whole church involved, I get new energy as a leader of a church. In other words, I heard one pastor say, I thought my adventure or my best days were behind me, but now I'm starting to see that the adventure and my best days may be in front of me, even though I've been a pastor for 30 years. And so, this concept of biblical generosity and walking into this, it can really energize a church in a more sustainable and long-term way than just one specific focus on a capital project. That's been my experience as well.
Thank you, Patrick. This will be the last question. How do you get people to let their guard down when you want to grow them in generosity? People seem suspicious of us.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we know in the Western context we live that everybody has an agenda for our life, right? That especially as a leader of a church, you know that people come to you all the time with agendas. And so when you talk about this concept of generosity, spiritual transformation, talk about the four that you want for them. lead with that kind of language of, 1 Timothy 6:17, God says this is the life that is truly life. Acts 20:35, it's more blessed to give than to receive. There's so much scripture, it's rich. Lead with what you want for them. That's one thing. Just be honest with them. This is what I want for you. Second thing is, I always think it's best to talk and lead people on generosity outside of a campaign or outside of a financial need. So you can just tell them, hey, things are great. We want to celebrate what's going on, but we're going to spend 4 to 6 weeks on this because this is a part of your spiritual growth. And so there's no ask here. I want you to let your guard down, call it out. People are suspicious. Let your guard down, and really let's go in this together because it's so much richer than what we typically think. So I think leading with the for language and also doing it apart from an appeal or an ask is really powerful. So let me close with this. Jim already went through this, but we talk about the generosity ladder. If you want to go to the e-paper, you can go to generouschurch.com/Wesleyan, and it's about a 7-page e-paper that we really talk about the generosity ladder and we go in detail. That's a really key discipleship paradigm that we use when it comes to generosity. I encourage you to download that. And I'd also encourage you to get with Jim. These generosity encounters, people come out of that very energized. And I would encourage you, if you go to one of those, to bring 2 to 3 people from your church if you can, because you want to experience this with a group of people from your church so that you don't have to go back and tell them what you experienced. It will be unique. It'll be different than what you've ever experienced, and it'll go much deeper than we're able to go in 48 minutes on a webinar. So I'd encourage you to get in touch with Jim on that as well.
Thank you, Patrick and Sharon, for sharing with us. And if you have any questions, again, you can email us. And in a week or so, this will be online, and we can email out the slides also. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.